The snow fell in thick, soft flakes as Evan Calloway's sleek black sedan glided into Starlight Falls. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw set. The glowing decorations that adorned the town were just as extravagant as he remembered, if not more so. Every lamppost twinkled with garlands and lights, while shop windows displayed cheerful holiday scenes. The townsfolk bustled about, bundled in coats and scarves, smiling as though they didn't have a care in the world. Evan scoffed silently. This wasn't his world anymore. The GPS directed him to turn onto a narrow, snow-covered street. At the end stood the Calloway house, a modest two-story home with a sagging porch and a freshly shoveled walkway. It looked smaller than he remembered, yet somehow, it still loomed large with the weight of memories he'd long tried to forget. Evan stepped out of the car, his polished leather shoes crunching against the snow. He tugged his overcoat tighter against the biting wind and walked up the path. The door creaked open before he could knock. "Evan," came the familiar voice of his father, Walter Calloway. The older man stood in the doorway, his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes weathered but sharp. He wore an old sweater with a reindeer stitched across the chest, as though he were auditioning for a holiday catalog. "You actually came. Don't make it sound like a miracle," Evan replied flatly, brushing past him into the warm house. The smell of pine and cinnamon assaulted his senses, along with something faintly metallic, like memories he'd rather not recall. "I'm here to take care of things. That's all." Walter closed the door and turned to face him. "It's Christmas, Evan. A time for family, not just business." Evan ignored the sentiment, letting his gaze drift over the living room. It was cluttered with old furniture, the edges softened by years of wear. Strings of popcorn and cranberries draped over the small Christmas tree in the corner, and an angel with a chipped wing sat at the top. It was painfully quaint, the kind of scene he'd escaped from the moment he had the chance. "I'm selling the house," Evan said, breaking the silence. "It's what Mom wanted, and frankly, I think it's time." Walter frowned. "Time for what? To forget where you came from?" "This house isn't just a building. It's a home. It's history. History I've moved past." Evan shot back, his voice clipped. "And you should too. Look at this place, Dad. It's falling apart." Walter's face hardened, and for a moment, he looked every bit like the man Evan had once feared as a child. "But instead of snapping," Walter sighed, "your mother loved this house. And it was always her dream that you'd come back here one day, that you'd see there's more to life than money." Evan's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the tension. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. "I don't have time for lectures. I have meetings to get back to, and I can't stay long." "You can't stay through Christmas?" Walter's voice softened, a note of disappointment slipping through. "It's been 25 years, Evan. Do you think maybe you could just try?" Evan hesitated. He hated the way his father's words stirred something unwelcome inside him. Guilt, regret, feelings he had no time for. "I'll think about it," he said curtly, though they both knew it was a lie. Walter nodded, his expression unreadable. "Suit yourself. But there's something happening at the community center tomorrow night. You should come." "The community center?" Evan asked, raising an eyebrow. "Is that still a thing?" "It's more than a thing," Walter replied. "It's where people come when they need help. You might remember something about that." Evan didn't answer. He turned back toward the door. "I'll see you tomorrow." "Maybe." Walter watched him go, his hand resting on the frame of the door long after the sound of the car engine had faded into the cold night. Later that evening, as Evan sat in the guest room scrolling through emails, his mind wandered to the town he'd left behind. The streets of Starlight Falls hadn't changed much, but Evan had. Or at least, that's what he told himself. Yet for reasons he couldn't explain, his father's words lingered, tugging at something deep within him. As the snow piled higher outside, Evan tried to focus on the numbers in front of him. But every so often, his eyes drifted toward the small, frost-covered window. Through it, he could see the faint glow of lights from the town below, a town that seemed determined to remind him of everything he thought he'd forgotten. And despite himself, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that coming back to Starlight Falls might end up being far more complicated than he'd planned. The next morning, Evan woke to the sound of children laughing outside. He pulled back the curtain and squinted at the brightness of the snow-covered street. A group of kids, bundled in mismatched winter gear, were building a lopsided snowman. Their joy was almost irritating in its purity. He shook his head, trying to brush off the vague unease that had settled over him since stepping foot in Starlight Falls. After dressing, Evan found Walter in the kitchen, humming softly as he poured batter onto an ancient waffle iron. The smell of syrup and butter filled the small space, a scent that, to Evan's annoyance, tugged at distant memories of lazy Saturday mornings long ago. "Morning," Walter said without turning. "Coffee's on the counter." Evan poured himself a mug and leaned against the doorframe, watching his father work. Walter moved slowly, a slight stiffness in his gait that Evan hadn't noticed before. He wondered briefly how long that had been the case, but he shook the thought away. Sentimentality wouldn't help either of them. "So, about the community center thing," Evan began, keeping his tone casual. "What exactly are you involved in there?" Walter looked up, his eyes lighting with a mix of pride and enthusiasm. "We run an outreach program. Meals, shelter, job assistance. Things people need to get back on their feet. Especially this time of year." Evan sipped his coffee, feeling the familiar tug of skepticism. "And let me guess, it's underfunded and you're trying to keep it afloat?" Walter chuckled, though there was an edge to it. "You always did have a way of cutting to the chase." "Yes, we're struggling. But it's not just about money, Evan. It's about people, right?" Evan muttered, setting his mug down. "Well, I hope the people appreciate all the sacrifices you've made." Walter turned back to the waffles, his shoulders stiffening. "You don't know the half of it." Evan opened his mouth to reply, but the doorbell interrupted. Walter wiped his hands on a towel and shuffled to answer it. Moments later, a bright, energetic voice echoed through the house. "Mr. Calloway, I made you a Christmas card." Evan peeked around the corner to see a little girl, no older than 10, holding up a piece of paper covered in glitter and crayon drawings. Her red scarf was wound so tightly around her neck that it seemed to swallow half her face, but her smile was unmistakable. "Lila," Walter exclaimed, bending slightly to accept the card. "This is beautiful." "Thank you." Lila beamed, then noticed Evan watching. She tilted her head curiously. "Who's that?" "That's my son, Evan," Walter said. "Evan, this is Lila." Evan gave a polite nod. "Nice to meet you." Lila squinted at him, as if sizing him up. "You look like you don't like Christmas very much." Walter barked a laugh. "She's sharp, isn't she?" Evan managed a thin smile. "Let's just say I'm more of a practical kind of person." Lila didn't seem convinced. "Christmas is about more than decorations and stuff, you know. It's about helping people and being together." "Is that so?" Evan replied, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "I'll keep that in mind." Before Lila could respond, a woman appeared at the doorway, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She wore a worn coat, but her posture was proud and confident. "Lila, you can't just run into people's houses." "It's fine, Clara," Walter assured her. "She's always welcome here." Clara smiled gratefully before turning to Evan. "You must be Walter's son. I've heard a lot about you." "All good things, I hope," Evan said lightly, though he doubted it. Clara's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Lila and I live at the community center. Your father has been a huge help to us." Evan raised an eyebrow. "At the community center? So you're—" "Evan," Walter cut in sharply, his tone a warning. "Don't." Evan bit back whatever he'd been about to say and gave a curt nod instead. Clara's expression remained polite, but there was a flicker of something, disappointment, in her eyes. She guided Lila back toward the door, thanking Walter again before they left. As soon as they were gone, Walter turned to Evan, his expression hard. "You might want to think before you speak next time." Evan crossed his arms. "I wasn't going to say anything inappropriate. Intentional or not, your words have weight," Walter said. "And people like Clara don't need more judgment. They've had enough of it." Evan didn't reply. Instead, he stared out the window, watching Clara and Lila walk down the snowy street. Something about the little girl's unshakable optimism struck a chord he didn't want to admit was there. Later that day, Evan reluctantly agreed to accompany Walter to the community center. The building was modest, its exterior weathered by years of harsh winters. Inside, however, it was warm and bustling. Volunteers moved between tables, serving hot meals and handing out donated clothes. Lila darted between the rows of people, her scarf trailing behind her like a ribbon, as she handed out candy canes to anyone who would take them. Walter introduced Evan to several of the volunteers, each of whom spoke warmly about his father's dedication. It was clear that Walter was not just a figurehead here. He was deeply involved in every aspect of the center's operations. Evan found himself both impressed and slightly irritated. His father had always been like this, throwing himself into causes while neglecting the things closer to home. As the evening wore on, Evan noticed Clara sitting at a table, helping an elderly man wrap a small package. Her face was serene, but there was a weariness in her eyes that spoke of struggles she didn't share openly. Lila sat nearby, drawing something on a scrap of paper. Evan approached hesitantly, unsure why he felt compelled to engage. "What are you working on?" he asked Lila. She looked up, holding out the paper. "It's a present for Grandpa Walter." Evan blinked. "Grandpa Walter?" Lila nodded enthusiastically. "That's what everyone calls him. He's like family to us." Evan glanced at Clara, who gave a small, knowing smile. "He's made a big difference in a lot of people's lives," she said softly. Evan didn't respond. Instead, he looked around the room, taking in the laughter, the shared meals, the sense of community that seemed to radiate from every corner. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. A feeling that, perhaps, he'd been missing something important all along. The following morning, Evan lingered in the kitchen, sipping his coffee as Walter prepared for the day. The older man moved with purpose, gathering papers, stuffing them into a tattered leather briefcase that looked older than Evan. The air between them was quieter than the day before, less charged with unspoken accusations, but no less awkward. "You coming to the center again today?" Walter asked without looking up. Evan considered his response. "I've got some work to take care of," he said. It wasn't entirely a lie. His inbox was overflowing, and he was overdue to check in with his assistant in New York. Still, the idea of returning to the community center felt complicated. Walter merely nodded, his face neutral. "Suit yourself." The door shut behind him with a muted click, and Evan found himself alone. He settled at the small dining table, his laptop glowing with spreadsheets and emails that should have demanded his full attention. But his mind wandered, his thoughts drifting back to the faces at the community center. Clara, the volunteers, and especially Lila, with her endless energy and determination to spread joy. As if summoned by the thought, a knock interrupted his concentration. He opened the door to find Lila standing there, bundled in her scarf, her hands clutching a tattered piece of paper. "Hi, Mr. Evan," she said cheerfully. "Can you help me?" Evan blinked. "Help you with what?" She thrust the paper toward him. "This is my list." He glanced at it. In uneven, childish handwriting, the page was covered with items labeled Grandpa Walter's Christmas. There were things like fix the leaky roof at the center, make a giant cookie for everyone, and find a really good present for Grandpa Walter. Evan looked back at her, baffled. "And you think I'm the guy to help you with this? You're smart and you have a car," she said matter-of-factly. "I can't drive and Mom's busy." He sighed, already regretting what he was about to say. "Fine, but only for an hour." Lila grinned, her joy so infectious that Evan almost smiled in return. Almost. Their first stop was the hardware store on Main Street. Lila chattered endlessly as Evan browsed for supplies to patch the roof, explaining how Walter had once fixed her broken sled and why it was important that the roof doesn't drip on people's heads. Evan half listened, more focused on deciphering the difference between caulk and sealant, but he couldn't entirely tune her out. There was something about her relentless optimism that made the town's holiday cheer feel less grating. With the supplies purchased and stashed in the trunk, their next stop was the bakery. Lila insisted on choosing the biggest cookie they had, which turned out to be a comically oversized gingerbread man. Evan paid for it, ignoring the amused look from the clerk. "You're pretty nice for someone who doesn't like Christmas," Lila said as they left the bakery. "Don't get used to it," Evan replied, though his tone was softer than he intended. The last item on her list was the really good present. Lila was vague about what this meant, only saying that it had to be special, like Walter. They wandered into a small gift shop, where she examined everything from hand-carved ornaments to antique books. Evan felt a flicker of impatience, but held his tongue. Finally, Lila's eyes landed on an old-fashioned snow globe. Inside, a tiny, glittering version of Starlight Falls was encased in glass, complete with twinkling lights and a spinning train. She held it up, her face glowing. "This is it," she whispered. Evan glanced at the price tag. "It's not cheap." "I'll use my allowance," she said quickly, digging into her pocket and pulling out a handful of crumpled dollar bills and coins. It wasn't nearly enough. Without a word, Evan pulled out his wallet and handed his credit card to the clerk. Lila looked up at him, wide-eyed. "Really? Consider it a loan," he said gruffly. They returned to the community center just as Walter arrived. The older man's face lit up at the sight of Lila, who immediately dragged him toward the cookie, the roof supplies, and finally the snow globe, presenting each one as though it were the greatest gift in the world. Walter laughed, his joy so genuine that Evan felt an unexpected pang in his chest. "You had something to do with this, didn't you?" Walter asked, his tone both teasing and surprised. "Lila's the mastermind," Evan said, shrugging. "I just drove." Walter's gaze softened, and for a moment, there was something like gratitude in his expression. "Well, thank you. It means a lot." Evan shifted uncomfortably, not sure how to respond. He excused himself to the edge of the room, watching as the center came alive with preparations for that evening's holiday dinner. Volunteers bustled around with decorations and food, while children raced through the hall, their laughter filling the space. Clara approached him, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Looks like you've been busy." "Lila's persuasive," Evan said, accepting the cup. "She has a way of pulling people in," Clara agreed, smiling. "And you seem like someone who needed a little pulling." Evan raised an eyebrow. "Is that your way of saying I don't belong here?" "No," she said simply. "It's my way of saying you might belong more than you think." Before he could respond, Lila ran up to them, her face flushed with excitement. "Come on, Mr. Evan. We're making Christmas cards for everyone." Clara chuckled. "Looks like you're being summoned." Evan hesitated, glancing between Lila's eager face and the comforting buzz of the center around him. Against his better judgment, he followed her to a table covered in construction paper, glue, and glitter. As Lila handed him a pair of scissors, he realized that, for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about work or deadlines or his next flight back to New York. For the first time, he was just present. The evening brought a flurry of activity as the community center prepared for its annual holiday dinner. The large hall had been transformed with strings of white lights, pine garlands, and mismatched but charming decorations donated by local families. Tables were set with care, each adorned with simple red and green centerpieces that Lila had helped assemble earlier in the day. The smell of roasted turkey, sweet potatoes, and warm bread filled the air, creating a sense of comfort that seemed to envelop everyone who entered. Evan found himself standing near the doorway, watching the room fill with people. Families, couples, and individuals of all ages trickled in, greeted warmly by volunteers and each other. The energy was infectious, a palpable sense of connection and joy that Evan couldn't ignore, no matter how much he wanted to. He wasn't sure what to do with himself, so he stayed out of the way, observing from a distance. Walter, on the other hand, moved effortlessly through the crowd. He greeted everyone by name, stopping to chat with a laugh or a pat on the back. It was clear he was more than just a figure of authority here. He was a cornerstone of this little world, someone who made others feel seen and valued. Evan couldn't help but marvel at the contrast between this version of his father and the man he'd known growing up, a man who had seemed more preoccupied with fixing the world than being present at home. "Why don't you grab a plate?" Clara's voice interrupted his thoughts. She stood beside him, a gentle smile on her face. "Everyone's welcome tonight, even skeptical New Yorkers." Evan gave a small, reluctant chuckle. "I'm not much for turkey dinners." "Not even at Christmas?" she asked, tilting her head. He shrugged. "It's just another day to me." Clara studied him for a moment, her expression softening. Maybe it doesn't have to be. You know, Lila's been talking about you all day. She thinks you're some kind of Christmas hero. Evan glanced across the room, where Lila was helping a group of children decorate cookies. She laughed as one of the boys smeared frosting on her nose, her joy uncontained. He felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Guilt, maybe, or the faint hope that he could live up to her belief in him. I think she's overestimating me, he said quietly. Kids have a way of seeing the best in people, Clara replied. Sometimes even before we see it in ourselves. Evan didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded and made his way toward the food tables. He loaded a plate, not because he was particularly hungry, but because it gave him something to do. As he settled at a table near the back of the room, Walter appeared beside him, holding his own plate. Mind if I join you? Walter asked. Evan gestured to the empty chair across from him. Walter sat, his movements slower than they used to be, though he tried to hide it. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the noise of the room filling the gaps between them. You've been good with Lila, Walter said eventually. She's taken a shine to you. She's persistent, Evan replied. Reminds me of someone. Walter smiled faintly. She's got a big heart, just like her mom. They've been through a lot, but they don't let it drag them down. Evan nodded, unsure what to say. He wasn't used to conversations like this, ones that touched on things that mattered. He was better at keeping things surface level, transactional. Look, Walter continued, setting down his fork. I know you think I wasn't there for you the way I should have been, and maybe you're right. I made mistakes. I thought I was doing the right thing, putting my energy into causes that mattered. But I see now that you needed more from me. Evan stiffened, caught off guard by the admission. It's not about blame, Dad. It's about feeling like you weren't enough. Walter interrupted gently. I get it, but you were. You always were. I just didn't know how to show it back then. Evan looked down at his plate, his throat tightening. He didn't know how to respond to his father's honesty, so he didn't try. They sat in silence again, the unspoken words settling between them like freshly fallen snow. The evening wound down slowly, with families saying their goodbyes and volunteers beginning to clean up. Lila found Evan near the doorway as he was putting on his coat. Wait, she said, tugging on his sleeve. You can't leave yet. Why not? He asked, amused by her urgency. Because we haven't done the Christmas tree yet, she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Evan hesitated, glancing at Walter, who gave him an encouraging nod. It's tradition, Walter said. We light the tree together at the end of the night. With a sigh that wasn't entirely reluctant, Evan followed Lila and the others to the corner of the room, where a tall pine tree stood adorned with ornaments and strings of popcorn. The crowd gathered around, their voices lowering to a hum of anticipation. Lila held the plug for the lights, looking up at Evan. Do you want to do it? He hesitated, then knelt beside her. Together, they plugged in the lights, and the tree came alive with a warm, golden glow. The room erupted into cheers and applause, and for a brief moment, Evan felt something stir deep inside him. It wasn't the hollow satisfaction of closing a deal or watching his bank account grow. It was something richer, something that felt like belonging. As the night came to an end and the guests filed out into the snowy streets, Evan lingered near the tree, watching the way the lights reflected in the windows. Walter approached, resting a hand on his shoulder. Thank you for staying, Walter said quietly. Evan nodded, his throat tight again. Maybe it's not just another day after all. Walter smiled, and for the first time in years, Evan felt like he'd finally come home. The next morning, the streets of Starlight Falls were quiet under a fresh blanket of snow. Evan woke early, though he wasn't sure why. The house was still, the kind of silence that only winter mornings seemed to bring. He dressed quickly, pulling on his coat and boots, and stepped outside. The cold air hit him like a sharp slap, but it was bracing, clearing the fog from his mind. He wandered without a destination, his feet crunching through the snow as his thoughts drifted. The events of the previous evening replayed in his mind. The warmth of the community, the glowing Christmas tree, Lila's wide-eyed excitement. For the first time in a long while, he felt the faint stirrings of something he couldn't quite name. Peace, maybe, or a sense of purpose. It was disorienting, but not entirely unwelcome. His meandering brought him to the community center, where the building stood quiet and unassuming in the early light. He let himself in, the door creaking slightly as it opened. Inside, the remnants of last night's celebration were still visible, folded chairs stacked against the wall, tables waiting to be cleared. The scent of pine and cinnamon lingered faintly in the air. Evan wasn't alone for long. Walter arrived not 10 minutes later, bundled in his old coat and scarf, his breath visible in the cold. He stopped short when he saw Evan. "Didn't expect to see you here this early," Walter said, setting down the bag of supplies he carried. Evan shrugged. "Figured I'd lend a hand." Walter raised an eyebrow, but his expression softened. "Well, I won't turn down help." They worked in companionable silence, folding tablecloths and sweeping floors. Walter moved slower than Evan remembered, his steps careful, his hands occasionally trembling. It was subtle, but noticeable. Evan wanted to ask if he was all right, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. As they finished clearing the main hall, Walter paused, leaning against the broom. "You know," he began, his tone casual but deliberate, "it means a lot to me that you've been spending time here." Evan looked up from the table he was wiping down. "I wouldn't read too much into it." Walter chuckled softly. "Fair enough. But it's good to see you back in this town." "Good to see you back." Evan didn't reply. He wasn't ready to unpack what that might mean. For Walter, for himself, or for the tenuous thread of connection they were trying to rebuild. Instead, he changed the subject. "So, what's the plan for today?" Walter straightened, his face brightening. "We've got a few families coming by to pick up donations. After that, Lila wants to organize a caroling group. You might have noticed, she's not one to take no for an answer." Evan allowed himself a small smile. "Yeah, I've noticed." True to Walter's word, the morning was a flurry of activity as families arrived at the center. Evan found himself handing out coats and canned goods, his initial awkwardness gradually giving way to a rhythm. Each person he helped thanked him warmly, their gratitude genuine and unfiltered. It was strange, this feeling of doing something for someone else without expecting anything in return. Strange, but good. Lila appeared shortly after noon, dragging Clara along with her. She was carrying a stack of sheet music and wearing a Santa hat that was slightly too big for her head. "Mr. Evan," she called, waving him over. "We need singers." Evan approached warily. "I'm not much of a singer." "That's okay," Lila said cheerfully. "You can just pretend." "I'm not sure the rest of the group will appreciate that," Clara laughed. "She's very persuasive, isn't she?" "She could sell snow to a snowman," Evan muttered, though there was no real annoyance in his voice. Lila thrust a sheet of music into his hands. "Come on, it'll be fun." Evan reluctantly joined the group, which consisted of Lila, Clara, Walter, and a handful of volunteers from the center. They practiced a few songs in the hall before setting off into the town. Despite himself, Evan found the experience oddly enjoyable. The residents of Starlight Falls greeted the carolers warmly, inviting them onto porches and offering hot cocoa in exchange for a song or two. By the time they returned to the community center, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the snow. Lila skipped ahead, her energy seemingly endless, while Clara and Walter walked side by side, their conversation quiet but animated. Evan hung back, watching them. The sight of his father so at ease, surrounded by people who clearly cared about him, stirred something in Evan that he wasn't ready to face. He'd spent so many years resenting Walter, building a narrative in his mind about a man who cared more about strangers than his own family. But seeing Walter here, in his element, Evan couldn't deny the truth. His father's sacrifices had never been about neglect. They'd been about love, even if it had been a love Evan hadn't understood at the time. That evening, as the group gathered around a small fire pit outside the center, Lila presented Walter with the snow globe she'd chosen. His eyes widened in surprise as he turned it over in his hands, the glittering scene inside catching the light. "This is beautiful, Lila," Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," Lila beamed. "It's because you make this place feel like Christmas all year round." Walter's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly, pulling Lila into a gentle hug. Evan watched from a few steps away, his chest tightening. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen his father so vulnerable, so openly moved. As the fire crackled and the group shared stories and laughter, Evan found himself looking around at the faces illuminated by the flickering light. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't an outsider looking in. He wasn't sure what that meant yet, but he knew one thing. Something in him was shifting, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to fight it. The next morning, Evan found himself standing in Walter's small kitchen again, a cup of steaming coffee in hand. The warmth of the mug seeped into his fingers as he stared out the frosted window, watching the snow fall in soft, lazy spirals. He hadn't slept well. His mind kept replaying scenes from the night before. The way Walter's face had softened when Lila gave him the snow globe, the quiet joy that seemed to radiate from everyone around the fire, and the unexpected sense of belonging that had crept up on him. Walter entered the room, his movements deliberate as he folded an old quilt and placed it on the back of a chair. Evan turned to face him, noticing again the slight stiffness in his father's gait. "You're up early," Walter said, his tone light but tinged with curiosity. "Couldn't sleep," Evan replied. He gestured toward the window. "Snow's picking up." "It'll do that," Walter said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "It's nothing the town can't handle." Evan hesitated, then set his mug down on the counter. "How long have you been having trouble getting around?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Walter didn't meet his eyes. "I'm fine, Dad," Evan pressed, his tone firmer. "I've been watching you all week." "You're not fine," Walter sighed, leaning against the counter. For a moment, he seemed to weigh his words carefully. "It's just arthritis," he said finally. "Nothing to worry about." Evan frowned. "That doesn't explain why you look like you're in pain every time you stand up." "It's not something I need your concern over," Walter said, his voice taking on an edge. "I've been managing just fine." Evan didn't push further, though unease settled heavily in his chest. He'd always known his father to be proud, sometimes to a fault. If Walter was struggling, it was clear he had no intention of admitting it, let alone asking for help. Later that day, Evan found himself back at the community center, this time without Walter. Clara had asked him to help organize donations in the storage room, a task that, while tedious, gave him time to think. The space was cramped, filled with mismatched bins of clothes, canned goods, and toys. As he sorted through a box of winter jackets, he noticed Clara watching him from the doorway. "You're surprisingly good at this," she said, stepping inside. "Let's just say I have a knack for order," Evan replied, folding a jacket neatly and placing it in the pile. Years of managing chaos in the corporate world, Clara leaned against the wall, crossing her arms. "You're not what I expected." Evan looked up at her, raising an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" "Someone colder, I guess," she admitted. "Walter talks about you sometimes, but he doesn't say much. I got the impression you didn't see eye to eye." "We don't," Evan said simply. "At least, we didn't." "It's complicated." "Family usually is," Clara said. "But I think he's proud of you, even if he doesn't say it outright." Evan didn't respond immediately, unsure how to process that. Pride wasn't something he associated with his father's view of him. He'd spent so much of his life feeling like he wasn't enough for Walter, like his ambitions and successes were somehow a betrayal of the values his father held dear. "I don't think I've ever understood him," Evan said finally. "Not really." Clara smiled softly. "Maybe you're starting to." As the day went on, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the town in a quiet stillness. By evening, the streets were nearly impassable, and the community center became a refuge for those who couldn't make it home. Families huddled together in the main hall, sharing stories and laughter as volunteers passed out blankets and hot cocoa. Lila, of course, was in the middle of it all, orchestrating games for the children and spreading her infectious cheer. Evan stayed late, helping wherever he could. At one point, he caught Walter sitting at a table with a young mother and her 2 children, his hands gesturing animatedly as he told a story that had the kids in fits of giggles. The sight was so ordinary, so natural, that it made Evan pause. This was who his father was, a man who gave everything he had to others, even when he had little left for himself. As the night wore on, Clara approached Evan with a concerned look. "Have you seen Walter?" Evan frowned. "Not recently." "Why?" "He said he needed some fresh air, but it's been over an hour," she said. "With the snow this heavy." A knot of worry tightened in Evan's stomach. Without a word, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and biting, but he didn't care. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes swirling in the wind, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. He called out for Walter, his voice barely carrying over the wind. There was no response, no sign of movement in the white expanse of the street. Panic began to creep in as he trudged through the snow, his boots sinking with each step. Finally, near the edge of town, he spotted a figure sitting on a bench beneath a street lamp. Walter was hunched over, his coat pulled tightly around him, his breath visible in the frigid air. Evan hurried over, his heart pounding. "Dad!" he exclaimed, kneeling beside him. "What are you doing out here?" Walter looked up, his face pale but calm. "I just needed a moment," he said quietly. "Didn't mean to worry anyone." "You can't just wander off in a snowstorm," Evan said, his voice sharper than he intended. "What were you thinking?" Walter sighed, his gaze drifting to the snow-covered street ahead. "I was thinking about your mother," he said softly. "This was her favorite time of year. She used to love sitting outside, watching the snow fall." Evan's anger faltered, replaced by a deep ache in his chest. He sat beside his father, the cold seeping through his coat, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I miss her too," Evan admitted finally, his voice barely audible. Walter glanced at him, his expression softening. "She'd be proud of you, you know, no matter what you think." Evan looked away, his throat tightening. He didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded. The two of them sat in silence, the snow falling softly around them, until the cold became too much to bear. When they returned to the community center, they were greeted with relief and warmth. Lila threw her arms around Walter, scolding him in her small, earnest way for scaring everyone. Walter laughed, ruffling her hair, and Evan felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. A sense of home, perhaps, or a fragile but growing hope that things could be different. As the night wore on, Evan found himself sitting alone by the fire, his thoughts quieter than they'd been in years. For the first time, he began to wonder if Starlight Falls wasn't just a stop on his journey, but a place he was meant to rediscover. The morning after the storm, Starlight Falls was draped in a blanket of white, so pristine it looked like a painting. The streets, still quiet, were flanked by snow-covered trees that shimmered in the sunlight. Evan stood at the window of Walter's living room, a cup of coffee warming his hands. He stared out at the peaceful scene, but his mind churned restlessly. The events of the previous evening lingered. His father's quiet vulnerability, the way he'd spoken about Evan's mother, and the fleeting moment of connection they'd shared. These were not things Evan had anticipated. They unsettled him, cracking the carefully built walls he'd maintained for so long. A part of him wanted to retreat, to book a flight back to New York and drown himself in the familiar chaos of work. But another part, quieter but insistent, urged him to stay. Walter entered the room, his coat already on. "I'm heading to the center," he said. "We've got more families coming in today, and the cleanup from last night isn't going to do itself." Evan nodded, setting his mug down. "I'll come with you." Walter paused, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, but he didn't comment. "All right then, let's get moving." At the community center, the aftermath of the storm was evident. Snow had piled up against the building's doors, and the sidewalks needed clearing. Evan grabbed a shovel and joined the volunteers who were already at work. The physical labor was oddly satisfying, giving him a sense of purpose that his usual routine lacked. As he worked, he overheard snippets of conversation. Neighbors helping neighbors, plans being made to deliver supplies to those still snowed in. The sense of community was palpable, and Evan couldn't help but feel drawn to it. Inside, the hall buzzed with activity. Volunteers sorted donations, served warm meals, and played with the children who had been brought by their families. Lila, of course, was in the middle of it all, her laughter ringing out as she raced around the room, her Santa hat slightly askew. Evan found himself smiling despite himself. Clara approached him as he stood near the donation tables, taking a brief break. She carried a tray of cookies, offering one to him. "You've been busy," she said, her eyes warm with approval. Evan accepted a cookie, biting into it before responding. "Figured I'd make myself useful." "You're doing more than that," she said. "I think Walter's glad to have you here, even if he doesn't say it." Evan glanced across the room, where his father was helping an older man carry a crate of supplies. Walter's movements were careful but deliberate, his face calm and focused. There was a quiet strength about him that Evan hadn't fully appreciated before. "I don't think I've made it easy for him," Evan admitted, his voice low. "For a long time, I blamed him for everything that went wrong. But now, I don't know. Maybe I've been looking at it all wrong." Clara smiled softly. "It's never too late to change how you see things, or to start fresh." Her words stayed with him as the day wore on. Evan found himself watching Walter closely, noticing the way he interacted with the people around him. Walter wasn't just respected, he was loved. Everyone he spoke to seemed to leave the conversation lighter, more hopeful. It was a kind of influence Evan had never sought for himself, but he couldn't deny its power. As the afternoon turned to evening, Walter gathered the volunteers for a brief meeting. The storm had left many families in need, and Walter outlined a plan to deliver supplies to those who couldn't make it to the center. Evan volunteered to help, taking a list of addresses and loading his car with boxes of food, blankets, and winter clothes. Clara joined him for the deliveries, and the two of them navigated the snow-covered streets together. Each stop brought a new encounter. A single mother grateful for the warm coats for her children, an elderly couple whose smiles lit up their small, cozy home, a man who had lost his job but found hope in the simple act of receiving help. By the time they returned to the center, Evan felt a deep weariness, but it was the good kind. The kind that came from knowing he'd done something that mattered. The center quieted as the evening wore on, the crowd thinning out until only a handful of volunteers remained. Walter sat at a table near the back of the hall, his head bowed as he went through a stack of papers. Evan approached, sitting across from him. "You look tired," Evan said, his tone light. Walter chuckled, setting the papers aside. "Comes with the territory." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of quiet conversation filling the space around them. Then, Walter spoke, his voice thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking about something your mother used to say," he said. "She always believed that no matter how hard things got, there was always a way to make things right. She said it was never too late to find your way back." Evan looked at his father, the weight of his words settling heavily. "Do you think I've waited too long?" Walter met his gaze, his expression soft but firm. "Never." The single word hit Evan harder than he expected. He nodded, swallowing against the tightness in his throat. For the first time, he felt like he could see a path forward. One that didn't involve running or hiding but staying, rebuilding, and finding meaning in the things he'd spent so long avoiding. As the volunteers packed up for the night, Evan lingered by the tree in the corner of the hall. Its lights twinkled softly, casting a warm glow over the room. Lila appeared beside him, holding a piece of paper. "What's that?" he asked. "It's a new list," she said, handing it to him. Evan unfolded the paper, reading the carefully written words. "Fix the roof, save the center, help Grandpa Walter smile more, make Mr. Evans stay." He glanced down at Lila, who was watching him with wide, hopeful eyes. "You're pretty sneaky, you know that?" She grinned. "Is it working?" Evan laughed, ruffling her hair. "Maybe." As the snow fell outside and the lights of Starlight Falls glowed in the distance, Evan felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what came next. He was here, in this moment, and it felt like enough. The following morning, Starlight Falls was alive with the buzz of preparation. Christmas Eve had arrived, and the town seemed to pulse with a shared energy, every corner adorned with twinkling lights and garlands. The community center was no exception. Volunteers hurried about, setting up tables, decorating the hall, and preparing for the evening's festivities. The air was filled with the comforting smells of roasted turkey, freshly baked pies, and spiced cider. Evan found himself in the thick of it, a stark contrast to his initial reluctance to engage. He carried crates of supplies, strung lights along the walls, and even helped a group of children hang ornaments on the large tree in the corner. Each task brought with it a small but meaningful interaction, a kind word from a volunteer, a laugh shared with one of the kids, or a smile from Clara, who seemed to be everywhere at once, keeping the operation running smoothly. Walter was there too, though he moved more slowly than the others. Evan noticed his father pausing often, resting his hands on his knees or leaning against a table. It was subtle, but it was enough to make Evan worry. He approached Walter mid-morning as his father was organizing a pile of gift bags for distribution later that evening. "You should take a break," Evan said, his voice low but firm. Walter waved him off with a smile. "I'm fine." "You always say that," Evan replied, crossing his arms. "But I'm not sure I believe you." Walter sighed, straightening up. "I appreciate your concern, but there's too much to do. These families depend on us. And they'll still depend on you tomorrow," Evan said. "But that won't matter if you push yourself too hard today." Walter looked at him for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, but only for a little while." Evan watched as his father settled into a chair near the edge of the room, a warm cup of cider in hand. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The hours slipped by, and before long, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the town in a golden glow. The community center came alive with the arrival of families, their voices filling the hall with laughter and conversation. Children darted around, their faces alight with excitement, while parents and grandparents greeted one another warmly. Evan stood near the entrance, watching the scene unfold. He felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude for being a part of something so meaningful, but also a nagging sense of guilt for the years he'd spent disconnected from his father and this town. He was still deep in thought when Lila appeared beside him, tugging at his sleeve. "Come on, Mr. Evan," she said, her face bright with anticipation. "We need to light the tree." Evan allowed himself to be pulled toward the large pine tree in the center of the hall. The room quieted as Walter stepped forward, holding the plug for the lights. He looked out at the crowd, his expression warm but tinged with emotion. "Before we light the tree, I just want to thank each and every one of you for being here tonight," Walter said, his voice steady but soft. "This center has always been more than just a building. It's a place where we come together, where we take care of each other, and where we find hope. None of this would be possible without all of you." The room erupted into applause, and Walter smiled, nodding in appreciation. He handed the plug to Lila, who held it out to Evan with a grin. "You do it," she said. Evan hesitated, then took the plug and knelt beside her. Together, they connected it to the outlet, and the tree came alive in a cascade of golden lights. The crowd cheered, and for a moment, the room felt like it was glowing from within, not just from the lights, but from the shared joy and connection that filled the air. As the evening wore on, Evan found himself talking to people he'd never met, but who seemed to know him through Walter. They shared stories of how his father had helped them, fixing a broken furnace in the dead of winter, delivering meals during hard times, or simply lending an ear when they needed someone to listen. Each story chipped away at the image Evan had carried of his father as someone distant and overly devoted to his work. Instead, he saw a man who had given selflessly, not out of obligation, but out of love. Later, as the crowd began to thin and families headed home, Evan sat with Walter near the fire pit outside. The flames crackled softly, sending up sparks into the cold night air. Walter seemed tired, but there was a contentment in his expression that Evan hadn't seen before. "You did good tonight," Walter said, breaking the silence. "The families really appreciated your help. I think I needed it more than they did," Evan admitted, staring into the flames. Walter glanced at him, his gaze steady. "You've been carrying a lot, haven't you?" Evan nodded. "For a long time, I blamed you for everything. For not being there, for choosing this place over us. But now, I'm starting to see it differently. I think I was just looking for someone to blame." Walter didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was quiet. "I've made mistakes, Evan, plenty of them, but I never stopped loving you or your mother. I thought I was doing what was right." Maybe I didn't always get it right. Evan looked at his father, the words catching in his throat. I know, and I think I understand now. It wasn't easy, was it? Balancing everything. No, it wasn't, Walter said, but I don't regret it, because it brought me here. And it brought you here, too. They sat in silence for a while longer, the fire warming them against the chill of the night. For the first time in years, Evan felt like he could breathe, like the weight he'd been carrying had lifted just a little. As they headed back inside, Clara approached them with Lila at her side. We've got one last surprise, Clara said, her eyes twinkling. She led them to the tree, where a group of children had placed a star at the top. Lila handed Evan a small ornament, a simple wooden heart with the words, "Home is where the heart is," carved into it. This is for you, Lila said, smiling shyly. Because you're part of our family now. Evan took the ornament, his throat tightening. He hung it on the tree, feeling the warmth of their shared connection surrounding him. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just visiting Starlight Falls. He was home. The following morning, Christmas Day, dawned with a tranquil stillness, the kind of quiet that comes only after a storm. Starlight Falls was serene, the snow reflecting the soft glow of the rising sun. Inside the community center, remnants of the previous night's celebration lingered. A faint smell of pine from the tree, the scattered sparkle of tinsel, and the distant echo of laughter that seemed to hang in the air. Evan woke early, the unfamiliar but welcome sense of peace still settling over him. His thoughts were clearer now, unclouded by the defensive walls he had kept up for so many years. He dressed and wandered to the kitchen, where he found Walter pouring coffee into a pair of mismatched mugs. Walter looked up and offered a small, tired smile. "Morning," Walter said, pushing a mug toward Evan. "Thought you might need this." Evan took the mug, wrapping his hands around it for warmth. "Thanks," he said, then hesitated. "I've been thinking about what you said last night. About it never being too late to find your way back." Walter nodded slowly, waiting for Evan to continue. The silence between them was heavy, not with tension, but with the weight of everything left unsaid over the years. "I spent so much time trying to prove I didn't need anyone," Evan admitted, his voice low. "But being here, seeing all of this, I don't think I ever stopped needing you." Walter's gaze softened, and he reached out, resting a hand on Evan's shoulder. "I've always been here, son, and I'm glad you're here now." The words struck a chord deep within Evan, and for a moment, he couldn't trust himself to speak. He sipped his coffee instead, letting the warmth seep through him, not just from the drink, but from the simple, quiet presence of his father. As the day unfolded, the town seemed to come alive with its own Christmas traditions. Families gathered for brunches, children bundled up to play in the snow, and the sound of carolers drifted through the streets. Lila appeared just before noon, her cheeks flushed from the cold and her Santa hat firmly in place. She bounded into the room, carrying a small stack of envelopes. "I made cards for everyone," she announced, holding them up proudly. She handed one to Walter, then another to Evan, before racing off to distribute the rest to the other volunteers. Evan opened his card, the childish scrawl inside bringing a smile to his face. To Mr. Evan, it read, "Thank you for being my friend. I hope you stay forever." He glanced at Walter, who was reading his own card with an equally soft expression. "She's something else," Evan said. "She is," Walter agreed. "She reminds me a bit of you, actually." Evan raised an eyebrow. "Me?" Walter chuckled. "When you were a kid, you had the same way of bringing people together, of making them feel like they mattered." Evan looked down at the card again, the words blurring slightly as a lump formed in his throat. He hadn't thought of himself that way in years, but hearing it from his father made him wonder if he'd lost something along the way, and if maybe, just maybe, he could find it again. The afternoon was spent at Walter's house, where Clara and Lila joined them for a small but heartfelt Christmas meal. The table was simple but welcoming, adorned with a red and white checkered tablecloth and a centerpiece of holly and candles. Clara had cooked most of the meal, though Walter had insisted on making his famous mashed potatoes. Evan, despite his lack of culinary skills, had been put in charge of carving the turkey. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily. Clara shared stories about her early days in Starlight Falls, and Lila recounted her plans for the new year, which included saving more stray animals and teaching herself to play the harmonica. Walter chimed in with tales from the community center, and Evan found himself laughing more than he had in years. After the meal, they gathered in the living room to exchange gifts. Most were small and practical: scarves, gloves, homemade treats, but each one was given with care. When it was Evan's turn, he handed Walter a rectangular package wrapped in plain brown paper. "I didn't have much time," Evan said, almost apologetically, "but I thought you might like this." Walter opened the package slowly, revealing a framed photo of a much younger version of himself, standing with a woman and a little boy. The boy was grinning ear to ear, clutching a fishing pole, while the woman looked on with a gentle smile. "I found it in one of Mom's old albums," Evan said. "I thought it belonged here." Walter's hands trembled slightly as he held the frame. "This was our first fishing trip," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mother spent the whole day trying to keep us from falling in the lake." They all laughed at the image Walter's words painted, and Evan felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of connection he hadn't realized he'd been missing. As the day turned to evening, Evan found himself alone on the porch, watching as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The cold air bit at his cheeks, but he didn't mind. For the first time in years, he felt at peace, not just with the world, but with himself. Walter joined him a few minutes later, a blanket draped over his shoulders. He didn't say anything at first, simply standing beside Evan and gazing out at the quiet street. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "You know," Walter said, his voice low, "I used to worry about whether you'd find your way, whether you'd be happy." Evan turned to look at his father, surprised by the admission. "I don't worry anymore," Walter continued. "You've got a good heart, Evan, and I think you're starting to see it for yourself." Evan felt his throat tighten again, but this time, he didn't fight it. He nodded, his voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside him. "Thanks, Dad." Walter smiled, a small but genuine smile that seemed to hold years of unspoken love and understanding. "Merry Christmas, son." "Merry Christmas, Dad." As they stood there, side by side, Evan realized that the past no longer felt like a weight around his neck. It was part of him, yes, but it didn't define him. What defined him now was this moment, this connection, and the quiet promise of all the moments still to come. The days following Christmas in Starlight Falls carried a quiet kind of magic. The holiday rush had settled into a peaceful rhythm, with townsfolk lingering in the afterglow of family gatherings and festive cheer. Evan stayed on, not out of obligation, but because leaving felt premature. For the first time in years, he wasn't running from anything. Not from his father, not from his past, and not from himself. Walter, though clearly exhausted from the holidays' events, was as involved as ever in the town's goings-on. Evan noticed the way his father moved slower than usual, pausing often to catch his breath. Concerned, he convinced Walter to let him accompany him to a doctor's appointment. It wasn't much, just a checkup, but the gravity of sitting in a waiting room, realizing how fragile his father truly was, settled heavily on Evan's shoulders. The doctor, a cheerful man with a no-nonsense demeanor, didn't sugarcoat things. Walter's health wasn't dire, but it was clear that years of hard work and neglecting his own well-being were catching up to him. He needed to slow down, take better care of himself, and, most importantly, accept help. Afterward, as they walked out into the cold afternoon air, Evan broke the silence. "You heard the doctor. You've got to let other people take the reins sometimes." Walter chuckled softly, but his expression was thoughtful. "I've always been bad at that. Letting go." "Well," Evan said, shoving his hands into his pockets, "maybe it's time you got better at it." "You've done enough, Dad." "More than enough." Walter didn't reply right away, but as they reached the truck, he gave Evan a small nod. It wasn't much, but it felt like the beginning of a shift. Back at the house, Clara and Lila were waiting with hot cocoa and a plate of leftover Christmas cookies. Lila had taken it upon herself to reorganize Walter's bookshelves, though her method seemed to involve stacking the books in colorful piles rather than any logical order. Walter feigned exasperation, but the twinkle in his eye betrayed his amusement. Evan watched the scene unfold, a realization settling over him. This wasn't just a visit or a temporary reprieve from his life back in the city. This was something he wanted to hold on to. The thought both terrified and comforted him. That evening, Evan sat down with Clara at the kitchen table while Lila played with a jigsaw puzzle on the floor. Walter had gone to bed early, worn out from the day's events. Clara poured them each a cup of tea, her eyes studying Evan with the quiet perceptiveness he'd come to admire. "You're thinking about staying," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. Evan hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I am. It feels right, being here. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be." Clara smiled softly, her hands cradling her cup. "This town has a way of doing that. It's not perfect, but it's full of good people. And it's home." Evan nodded again, the word resonating with him. Home. He'd spent so long chasing something he couldn't define, only to find it here, in the very place he'd once tried so hard to leave behind. The decision wasn't easy, though. Over the next few days, Evan wrestled with the logistics of uprooting his life in the city. There were practical matters to consider: his job, his apartment, his belongings. But every time he thought about returning to the sterile, impersonal routine he'd built for himself, it felt hollow. One afternoon, as he walked through the snowy streets of Starlight Falls, he found himself at the community center. The holiday decorations had been taken down, but the warmth of the place remained. Clara was there, along with a few other volunteers, preparing meals for families who were still struggling after the holidays. Evan offered to help, rolling up his sleeves and diving into the work without hesitation. As they packed food boxes and loaded them into cars, Evan noticed how seamlessly he'd become part of this world. He no longer felt like an outsider, watching from the edges. He belonged. Later, as he and Clara stood by the doorway, watching the last of the volunteers drive off, she turned to him with a knowing smile. "You've already made up your mind, haven't you?" Evan laughed, shaking his head. "You don't miss much, do you?" "No," she said simply. "And neither should you." That night, Evan sat down with Walter in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for the conversation. "I've decided to stay," he said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. Walter looked at him, his expression unreadable at first. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. "I hoped you might," he said, "but I didn't want to push." Evan chuckled. "You've never been much of a pusher, Dad." Walter leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "I always believed you'd find your way. I just didn't think it would lead you back here." "Neither did I," Evan admitted. "But I'm glad it did." Over the next few weeks, Evan began the process of rebuilding his life in Starlight Falls. He rented a small house not far from Walter's, started volunteering regularly at the community center, and even took up a part-time position helping Clara with the center's administrative work. It was a far cry from the high-powered world he'd once inhabited, but it felt right. As winter slowly gave way to the first hints of spring, Evan found himself feeling something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He was still figuring things out, still navigating the complexities of his relationship with Walter and the scars of his past, but for the first time, he wasn't doing it alone. One evening, as the sun set over the snow-dusted rooftops of Starlight Falls, Evan stood on his porch, a cup of coffee in hand. Lila's laughter echoed from next door, where she was helping Walter plant the first seeds in his small garden. Clara was there too, her voice carrying over the fence as she gave Lila instructions. Evan watched them, his heart full. This wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself, but it was the life he'd found. And it was enough. More than enough.